Before we begin, if you enjoy disturbing true stories, mysteries buried by time, and narratives that reveal what should never have been hidden, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next reports. And write in the comments, where are you watching from? Cities also hold secrets, and some stories begin exactly like this, with someone observing in silence. The Hawthorne Mansion stood on the outskirts of Black Hollow, a town too small to justify such an imposing and ancient building. Built in the 1930s, amidst the region's industrial boom, it seemed out of place in time, not only because of its architecture, but because of the persistent sense of abandonment emanating from its stone walls, darkened by weather and neglect. No family had stayed there for more than a generation. No attempt at renovation had progressed beyond the first few weeks. And yet, the property was never officially considered cursed. Ethan Caldwell parked his car in front of the rusty iron gate just before nightfall. The autumn sky was thick shades of grey, and the wind rustled through the dry trees with an irregular, almost organic sound. He turned off the engine and stood there for a few seconds, observing the house's facade. 3 stories, tall windows, no curtains. A silence that didn't seem natural for a structure of that size. Ethan was neither an adventurer nor someone driven by mystical impulses. He was a historian specializing in real estate archives and unresolved inheritances. A bureaucratic, precise job far removed from any romanticism. He had been hired to evaluate old documents related to the mansion after the death of the last known heir of the Hawthorne family, which had occurred weeks earlier under circumstances considered natural, albeit surrounded by convenient omissions. The town didn't like to talk about the house. Ethan had realized this on the very first day. The answers came short, accompanied by averted glances and abrupt changes of subject. There were no explicit legends, nor supernatural stories repeated in whispers, just a silent agreement that the place should remain closed. The interior of the mansion remained surprisingly intact. Thick dust covered antique furniture, but nothing indicated recent vandalism or break-ins. Crooked paintings remained on the walls, depicting men and women with rigid expressions, dating from another era. The air had an old smell, damp wood, aged paper, and something more difficult to identify, like rusted metal. The antagonism in that story didn't present itself in the form of a living person. It was entrenched within the house itself, in the incomplete records, in the interrupted contracts, in the pages torn from public archives between 1943 and 1946, a period too specific to be a coincidence. Ethan spent the first few days cataloging documents in the main office located on the 2nd floor. Each drawer revealed more gaps than answers. Death certificates without a specified cause, transfers of ownership registered but never finalized. A recurring name appeared in the oldest documents. Margaret Hawthorne officially disappeared in 1944 at the age of 27. There was no record of a body, nor of a funeral. The central conflict began to take shape when Ethan found an original blueprint of the mansion folded inside a safe embedded in the wall. The paper was yellowed, but legible. The structure of the property seemed ordinary until something caught his attention: the basement. According to City Hall records, the basement had been sealed off in 1945 due to structural instability. However, in the original blueprint, there was an officially unregistered subdivision, a smaller compartment with no indicated exit, isolated by walls thicker than the rest of the foundation. No subsequent document mentioned this space. The entrance to the main basement was behind the kitchen, hidden by a narrow, solid wood door. Ethan tried to open it that same night. The lock resisted. It wasn't just locked, it seemed sealed from the inside, as if someone had made sure it wouldn't be opened again. The mystery wasn't about what might be down there, but in a deliberate effort to erase its existence. Ethan felt, for the first time since accepting the job, that his presence in that house was not neutral. Each step he took seemed to cross an invisible line, something that had remained untouched for 8 decades. He wasn't just organizing forgotten files. He was approaching something that someone in the past had decided to bury without leaving a trace, and the mansion seemed to respond to this with an even denser silence. Black Hollow didn't appear on tourist maps or in national news reports. It was a town shaped by old factories, abandoned sawmills, and neighborhoods that grew too fast in the 1940s when the arms industry boosted the local economy during World War II. After that, the town slowly shrank, like a tired lung. What remained was a reduced, aging population, deeply distrustful of strangers. Ethan realized this from their very first interactions. The cafe on the main street had served the same menu for decades, and conversations always ceased whenever he entered. There was no explicit hostility, just a silent surveillance. He was watched as someone meddling in something that didn't concern him. The Hawthorne mansion was located away from the city center near an old dirt road that led to an industrial complex that had been inactive since the 1950s. During the war, that complex had been used to store strategic materials. Officially, there had never been a direct link between the factories and the Hawthorne family. Unofficially, the record suggested parallel contracts signed by intermediaries whose names did not appear in civil records. The house reflected this duality. On the upper floors, there was restrained luxury, imported furniture, European porcelain, books in French and German. On the ground floor, the atmosphere was more functional, almost austere, as if it had been adapted for something beyond a family residence. Reinforced doors, internal locks, windows smaller than the architectural standard of the time. Ethan began mapping the house as if studying an organism. Each corridor seemed to have been designed to restrict movement. Certain rooms could only be accessed via specific paths, forcing anyone inside to follow predictable routes. This didn't fit with a mansion designed solely for comfort. Among the few living people connected to that story was Helen Brooks, an employee at the local registry office for over 40 years. It was she who, reluctantly, confirmed to Ethan that many old records had been reorganized in the post-war years. Documents disappeared, dates were adjusted, certain surnames simply ceased to appear. Helen didn't speak out of immediate fear, but out of habit. In Black Hollow, one had learned early on that too many questions led to unpredictable consequences. Upon mentioning the name Margaret Hawthorne, the woman abruptly interrupted the conversation, closed the drawer she was organizing, and suggested that Ethan return another day. Another name appeared in the secondary files. Thomas Hawthorne, the patriarch of the family, an influential industrialist known for his public philanthropy, had funded hospitals, schools, and even a wing of the city hall. In contrast, his personal records showed a man obsessed with control. His wills were altered several times, containing restrictive clauses regarding heirs and explicit prohibitions on access to certain areas of the house, even for immediate family members. Margaret, their youngest daughter, was a complete departure from this profile. Photographs found in a forgotten box in the attic showed a young woman with a relaxed posture, simple clothes, and a defiant look, unlike the other family members who were always rigid and formal. There were letters addressed to her, never sent, written by someone identified only as R. The content was not romantic but urgent. It spoke of mistakes, of something that could not remain buried. Margaret's absence from later records was not treated as a tragedy. There were no public appeals, no documented investigation, just an administrative disappearance. Ethan also began to notice small physical inconsistencies in the house. The kitchen floor had an almost imperceptible unevenness, as if something heavy had been removed or installed there for many years. The walls near the basement stairs were colder to the touch, even during the day. It wasn't a supernatural phenomenon, but a structural one. Thicker concrete, reinforced insulation. Local culture reinforced silence. Black Hollow had prospered thanks to obedience and unwavering collaboration during times of war. Questioning necessary decisions was seen as treason. This trait remained deeply rooted, passed down from generation to generation. The past was not discussed because it had been too functional to be re-evaluated. Ethan was beginning to understand that the mansion was not just a physical space, but a point of convergence between power, fear, and historical erasure. Each character connected to that story seemed to carry a tacit pact to preserve what remained, even if it meant living with irreparable gaps. And in the center of those gaps, the basement remained, not as a forgotten space, but as something actively excluded from collective memory. The conflict ceased to be merely documentary in Ethan's third week on the job. Until then, everything had been reduced to incomplete paperwork, strange structures, and convenient silences, but the mansion began to react practically to his presence. Not with inexplicable phenomena, but with concrete, deliberate, almost human obstacles. The first change was subtle. Ethan noticed that some previously catalogued file boxes had been moved, not disappeared, just shifted a few centimeters, as if someone had examined their contents and tried to return them to their exact place, without success. The marks in the dust didn't match recent footprints. They were dragged imprecise, like hands pushing heavy wood with excessive caution. He changed the lock on the office that night. The next day, he found the new lock forced open from the inside. This ruled out external vandalism and reinforced an unsettling hypothesis. Someone still had access to the house, or always had. Ethan began sleeping at irregular hours, keeping the hallway lights on, not out of irrational fear, but as a strategy. The house didn't creak for no reason. Each creak came from a specific point, repeating patterns. The problem was that these patterns didn't correspond to the natural aging of the structure. The conflict intensified when he decided to ignore the city's tacit recommendation and attempted to access the basement using technical means. He used old blueprints to calculate the thickness of the walls and rented a simple structural scanning device, commonly used in renovations. The result was clear. There was an empty space beyond the officially registered area. It wasn't a collapse. It wasn't a measurement error. It was a planned compartment. While taking measurements, Ethan felt an unexpected resistance coming from within the house. The electricity failed only in the kitchen area. The rest of the mansion remained lit. The circuit breaker hadn't been tripped. Someone, or something, had specifically interrupted that line. The answer came hours later, in the form of an unexpected visit. Richard Holloway, a former municipal engineer, appeared at the door at dusk. He was over 70 years old, with a rigid posture and a gaze that assessed the surroundings as if revisiting an old mistake. He didn't ask to come in. He merely commented neutrally that certain foundations were not made to be reopened. Richard had been involved in public works projects in the post-war period. His name appeared in maintenance records for the mansion dating back to 1946, the same year the basement was officially sealed off. He didn't threaten Ethan. He didn't offer explanations. He simply made it clear that there were practical consequences for anyone who insisted on correcting the past. This encounter marked a definitive change. Ethan ceased to be just a researcher. He became an active nuisance. The subsequent obstacles were more straightforward. Documents began to disappear selectively, always those that mentioned Margaret or structural changes. The city council denied access to files under the pretext of internal reorganization. Ethan's contract underwent an unexpected revision, with reduced deadlines and vague clauses regarding civil liability. The pressure was not coming from a single antagonist, but from an entire system built to resist investigation. Even so, Ethan moved forward. One early morning, while exploring the hallway behind the kitchen, he found something that wasn't on any blueprint, an almost invisible vertical crack, disguised by the old paint. It wasn't a natural crack, it was a seam, a false wall. He carefully removed some of the plaster and found an oxidized metal surface. Unlike anything used in residential construction in the 1940s, this was no improvisation. It was applied engineering with a specific purpose. At this point, the conflict became both physical and moral. Ethan knew that moving forward meant crossing legal and historical boundaries. He also knew that retreating would perpetuate a lie that had spanned generations. The choice ceased to be about his career and became one about responsibility. The final layer of tension arose when he found a magnetic tape recording hidden inside a ventilation duct. The quality was poor, but the voice was clear. It was feminine. He didn't mention names. He didn't ask for help. He simply described objectively the procedures, schedules, and people involved in something that should never have happened inside a private residence. The recording ended abruptly, as if someone had interrupted the process midway. From that moment on, Ethan was no longer investigating a historical mystery. He was dealing with suppressed evidence and with people willing to ensure they remained buried. Ethan's progress in unraveling the mystery of the basement began to pull on parallel threads, each revealing small, uncomfortable truths that in isolation seemed harmless, but together formed a pattern that was difficult to ignore. None of these subplots deviated from the central conflict. On the contrary, they all converged on it, as if the very structure of the story demanded that they be confronted before any definitive revelation. The first subplot emerged from the magnetic tape. Ethan managed to restore part of the audio using improvised equipment. The female voice described shifts, containment procedures, and technical terms incompatible with a typical residence. There were indirect references to tests, not scientific in the academic sense, but operational, as if the mansion had served a logistical purpose during the war. The most disturbing detail was the narrator's tone, controlled, emotionless, like someone who had learned to survive through neutrality. This voice began to occupy an increasingly large space in Ethan's mind, not as a supernatural element, but as a human record that refused to remain silent. Meanwhile, he deepened his investigation into Richard Holloway. He discovered that the engineer had not only participated in the work of sealing off the basement, but had also signed safety reports that contradicted internal measurements by the city itself. The original reports had been replaced by abridged versions. The difference between them was not in the explicit content, but in what had been removed, references to sensitive materials and permanent isolation. Indeed, another subplot emerged through Laura Myers. Laura, a local history teacher, was one of the few people in town willing to speak to Ethan without apparent reservations. Laura had grown up hearing fragmented stories about the mansion, always told as vague warnings, never as facts. While reviewing old newspapers with Ethan, she identified a series of small notes published between 1943 and 1945. Power outages, unexplained noises coming from the property, nighttime deliveries made by unmarked military trucks. None of this was treated as a scandal. These were times of war. Questioning was not a priority. The relationship between Ethan and Laura didn't develop romantically or idealized. It was functional, based on the exchange of information and shared risk. Even so, her presence added an emotional layer to the conflict. For the first time, someone from the town itself seemed willing to break the silent pact that had sustained Black Hollow for decades. Time pressure began to mount. When Ethan received formal notification, he would have only 10 more days to complete the survey and hand over the property to the company responsible for the sale. The justification was administrative. The effect was clear. Time had ceased to be a resource and had become an enemy. At the same time, minor interferences increased. Ethan's car experienced recurring malfunctions only when parked near the mansion. His mail began arriving open. Laura reported being called for an informal conversation at City Hall, where they subtly suggested she distance herself from the researcher. These subplots weren't diversions, but cogs in the machine. Each one reinforced the idea that the basement hadn't just been locked, it had been protected by an active network of people, documents, and omissions. The complexity lay not in grand conspiracies, but in the banality of continuous collaboration. The final layer emerged when Ethan cross-referenced data from the tape with old hospital records. A small sanatorium, deactivated in the 1950s, showed unidentified admissions during the same period as the suspicious activities at the mansion. There were no names, only codes, and one of them was repeated on the magnetic tape, pronounced almost mechanically. Margaret Hawthorne was no longer just a missing heiress. Everything indicated that she had been integrated, voluntarily or involuntarily, into something that involved confinement, control, and institutionalized silence. The subplots closed in on the main conflict, narrowing Ethan's room for maneuver. Each new piece of information reduced his options, while simultaneously making it impossible to retreat without becoming complicit. The basement ceased to be merely a hidden physical space. It became the end point of a chain of decisions that had spanned generations and which now demanded resolution. The turning point didn't happen the moment Ethan opened the basement, but when he understood, because I hadn't done it yet. On the 9th night after receiving the eviction notice, the mansion suffered a total power outage, not partial, as before, not selective. Everything went dark at once, plunging the house into absolute darkness that not even the outside light seemed to penetrate. There was no wind, no storm, nor any recorded failure in the city's grid, just the sudden absence of electricity, as if someone had disconnected the house from the world. Ethan didn't try to restore power. He grabbed the flashlight, the original blueprint of the mansion, and went down to the kitchen. The unevenness in the floor, which had previously required careful measurements, now seemed too obvious to ignore. He moved aside the cabinet that partially covered the false wall and pressed the exact spot indicated by the blueprint. The mechanism responded with a dry snap. The wall didn't open completely. It only receded enough to reveal a narrow, rough concrete staircase, descending at a steeper angle than the rest of the official basement. The air that rose from there wasn't just cold. It was stagnant, laden with an old metallic smell, like rooms that had been closed off for decades without circulation. The staircase led to a space that was not mentioned in any public document. The compartment wasn't large, but it was necessary. Clinical. The walls were lined with insulating material, and the floor had discrete drains connected to independent pipes. There were no symbols, inscriptions, or any attempt at dramatization. It had been made to function, not to impress. In the center of the room, there was a metal structure fixed to the floor. It wasn't a traditional cell. It was an adjustable restraint platform, bearing the marks of prolonged use. Nearby, built-in cabinets contained sealed folders, all identified only by alphanumeric codes. Ethan opened one of them. The reports didn't mention formal scientific experiments. They talked about conditioning, prolonged isolation, controlled sensory exposure. The goal was not to discover something new, but to test human limits under extreme circumstances, something that, during the war, had been treated as necessary and afterwards as too inconvenient to remain on record. Margaret Hawthorne's name appeared only once, not as the main subject, but as operator. The revelation was abrupt and disconcerting. Margaret had not been merely a victim. She had been trained, instructed, and integrated into the workings of that space. The magnetic tape was not a cry for help. It was an informal report, recorded by someone who was beginning to question what she had helped to sustain. The real turning point came when Ethan found the last document in the file. Dated 1946, it authorized the definitive sealing of the compartment. The justification did not mention structural risks, but operational instability. Translated into simple terms, The system had ceased to be controllable. At the bottom of the page, there were two signatures, Thomas Hawthorne, Margaret Hawthorne. She hadn't disappeared that year. She had signed the closing document. Understanding hit Ethan harder than any previous threat. The basement hadn't been sealed to hide an isolated crime, but to end a process that had begun to slip out of moral and institutional control. Margaret hadn't been silenced by force. She had been consumed by the role she had assumed, becoming inseparable from what needed to be buried. The power was restored the instant Ethan exited the compartment. The following day, Richard Holloway was found dead in his home. Official cause: heart failure. No autopsy requested. No thorough investigation. The course of history had changed irreversibly. It was no longer a matter of revealing what was in the basement, but of deciding what to do with a truth that was never simple enough to simply be condemned. The consequences didn't manifest as an immediate shock, but as a silent reorganization of the forces surrounding Ethan. Richard Holloway's death didn't generate public mourning or speculation. The news was treated as a footnote in the local newspaper, sandwiched between real estate ads and weather reports. For Black Hollow, it was just another elderly person who had died at home. For Ethan, it was a clear warning that the past continued to have effects on the present. The city reacted quickly. On the same day that the mansion's power was restored, Ethan received a notice demanding the immediate cessation of any excavation or structural modifications. The document cited historical preservation, but the tone was coercive. There were short deadlines, hefty fines, and an implicit threat of criminal liability. It wasn't about preventing damage to the house, but about reconfine what was exposed. Laura also suffered consequences. She was temporarily removed from her duties at the school under the pretext of administrative reassessment. No formal charges, no possible defense. Her isolation reflected what had happened decades before. Those who got too close to the core of the problem were pushed to the margins. Ethan reacted pragmatically. He copied all the documents found in the hidden compartment, scanned the magnetic tape, and stored copies in different locations. He no longer trusted a single file or centralized systems. His reaction was not one of panic, but of adaptation. The mansion had ceased to be an object of study and had become an active point of risk. The nights grew more tense, not because of inexplicable noises, but because of concrete signs of surveillance. A car parked for hours on the nearby road. Lights that went out when he approached the windows, silent phone calls that ended after a few seconds, nothing explicit, everything calculated to wear him down. Internally, Ethan also underwent a change. The revelation about Margaret dismantled his initial interpretation of her as both victim and villain. He came to see her as a product of a context that had transformed obedience into virtue and silence into duty. This understanding did not bring comfort. It brought weight. If Margaret had chosen to sign the termination agreement, how many other people had made similar choices to preserve something greater than themselves? The most unexpected reaction came from the town itself. Small signs of division began to emerge. An anonymous envelope was left under the mansion door containing copies of military delivery receipts dated 1944. An older resident approached Ethan at the market and, without identifying himself, simply said that not everyone agreed with what was done. These reactions were not open support, but they indicated that consensus had never been absolute. The consequences also redefined the moral conflict. It became evident that exposing the truth would not mean automatic justice. It could result in further erasures, controlled narratives, and selective accountability. History offered no clean solutions. Ethan realized that simply revealing what was in the basement wasn't enough. He had to make a decision. When to do so, and whether that would actually break the cycle or just reorganize it in another form. The turning point had a lasting effect. The past was no longer something buried, but had become an active agent, reacting to every move of anyone who dared to touch it, and the margin of error decreased every day. Ethan's recovery phase didn't begin with sudden courage or internal speeches about doing the right thing. It began with a practical change. He stopped reacting and started to anticipate. Until then, his actions had been responses to external discoveries and pressures. Now, every action was calculated as part of a broader strategy. The first decision was to stop treating the mansion as a fixed base. Ethan began sleeping elsewhere, alternating between small roadside motels and the home of a distant acquaintance. He returned to the property only during the day, at irregular hours, reducing predictable patterns. This simple adaptation lessened the feeling of being trapped and gave him back a concrete form of control. Growth also manifested itself in how he handled information. Before, his priority was to understand the past in its entirety. Now, he selected what to investigate, focusing on what could generate real impact. Ethan went from being an exhaustive historian to an evidence curator, aware that an excess of truth, poorly presented, could be neutralized. Laura became involved again, despite their professional estrangement, not as an emotional ally, but as a strategic partner. Using her academic experience, she helped Ethan contextualize the documents so that they didn't seem like isolated accusations, but part of a recognizable historical pattern. The focus shifted from the mansion itself to the system that made it possible. Ethan's personal growth was evident in how he viewed Margaret Hawthorne. He abandoned the need to classify her as a heroine or an accomplice. He came to see her as someone who had crossed the same boundary that now stood before him. The point where continuing meant assuming irreversible responsibilities. This understanding did not paralyze him. It served as a reference point for what not to repeat. A new challenge arose when Ethan received an informal settlement offer. A legal representative from the company that had purchased the mansion suggested that the final report omit sensitive details in exchange for financial compensation and legal protection. There was no explicit threat, just the offer of a comfortable way out. Accepting would mean ending the conflict without direct confrontation. The overcoming was solidified in the refusal. There was no dramatization. Ethan simply replied that the report would reflect what had been found within legal limits, but without deliberate omissions. This decision marked a clear break from his initial behavior, when he sought to remain neutral to preserve his own career. The pressure mounted after that. Unexpected inspections, formal questioning of his methodology, attempts to discredit his professional competence. Instead of backing down, Ethan documented each interference, incorporating them as part of the larger context of historical obstruction. The growth was not only moral, but technical. Ethan structured the material in a way that would resist attempts at discrediting it. He cross-referenced sources, added parallel records, and included independent structural analyses. Each step aimed to reduce the possibility of the content being dismissed as speculation. By the end of this phase, Ethan was no longer the same man who had arrived in Black Hollow to organize old files. He had become someone willing to bear the weight of an imperfect truth, aware that overcoming it did not mean immediate victory, but the ability to keep moving forward without deviating. He didn't know if he would win, but he knew he wouldn't back down. The build-up to the climax wasn't marked by major isolated events, but by a steady acceleration, like a mechanism that, after decades of being stuck, began to spin too fast to be stopped. The subplots began to resolve themselves almost simultaneously, closing escape routes and pushing Ethan toward an inevitable confrontation. Laura gained access to a state archive that hadn't been digitized. It wasn't an explosive document, but a key piece, an internal memo from 1947 recommending the standardization of reports on unconventional facilities used during the war effort. The text didn't directly mention Hawthorne Manor, but it described procedures identical to those found in the hidden compartment. This connected Black Hollow to a larger context, removing the possibility of treating the case as a local exception. With that, the last major subplot came to a close, the idea that everything was the work of an isolated family. The mansion ceased to be the center of the problem and became a working example of something much broader. The deadline arrived. The purchasing company announced it would officially take over the property in 48 hours. After that, any access would depend on legal authorizations that Ethan knew he couldn't obtain. The time pressure became absolute. There was no more room for refinement or hesitation. Ethan spent the last day organizing the material, not just gathering evidence, but deciding the order of presentation, the narrative framing, the strategic omissions. He understood that the impact wouldn't come from the quantity of information, but from how it was connected. The basement, Margaret, the falsified reports, Richard's death, everything needed to converge on a single logical point. The city also mobilized. The police presence increased in the vicinity of the mansion, officially to ensure the safe transfer of the property. In practice, it was a discreet roadblock. There were no arrest warrants or direct confrontations, but the message was clear. Time was running out. The night before the transfer, Ethan returned to the mansion one last time, not to investigate, but to confirm. He walked slowly through the corridors like someone saying goodbye to a place that never truly belonged to him. In the hidden compartment, he found that some of the material had been removed, not everything. Just enough to show that someone had been there recently. This didn't destabilize him. It only confirmed what he already knew. The climax wouldn't occur inside the house, but outside of it. The final preparation was silent. Ethan sent encrypted packages to 3 different destinations: an independent journalistic consortium, an out-of-state university archive, and a lawyer specializing in institutional memory cases. It wasn't a heroic act, but a calculated move to ensure the information survived, even if he no longer controlled the narrative. At dawn, the mansion was surrounded. Technicians, lawyers, company representatives. None of them went into the basement. They didn't need to. The decisive confrontation wouldn't be physical. Everything was ready. What remained was the moment when the truth would cease to be merely discovered and would become exposed. The climax didn't begin with sirens or open confrontations, but with the publication. At 9:17 a.m., while company representatives were signing the final transfer documents for the Hawthorne mansion, the first dossier became public. Not as a sensationalist exposé, but as a structured investigation, backed by cross-referenced files, technical reports, and historical context. The journalistic consortium did not mention Ethan in the headline. The story was bigger than him. In less than an hour, the name Black Hollow ceased to be local. The impact was immediate. Requests for clarification came from the state level. Universities requested access to the raw material. The deactivated sanatorium was mentioned for the first time in decades in official documents. What might previously have been treated as a real estate problem became a matter of historical responsibility. The institutional reaction was swift but disorganized. The company suspended possession of the mansion. The city hall issued contradictory statements. Local authorities claimed ignorance, while files that did not exist began to surface under external pressure. The system, accustomed to silence, proved incapable of reacting to the coordinated exposure. The most tense moment occurred when Ethan was formally summoned to testify, not as an accused, but as a key witness. The summons was public, inevitable. For the first time, he was not isolated. During his testimony, Ethan did not attempt to dramatize. He presented the facts in the correct order, without excessive adjectives. The basement was not described as a chamber of horrors, but as a functional facility for human confinement. Margaret Hawthorne was not portrayed as a villain or a martyr, but as an operator of a system that lost control over what it had normalized. The turning point came when an additional document was attached to the case file by an anonymous source. It was an internal correspondence from the federal government, dated 1952, informally acknowledging the existence of human restraint procedures carried out outside of official military installations, and recommending their gradual erasure from institutional memory. This shifted the center of the conflict. The focus shifted away from Ethan, the mansion, or even the Hawthorne family. It became historical model who allowed all of that to happen and be kept silent for almost 80 years. Ethan's transformation became visible there. He did not seek personal absolution or recognition. When asked if he believed he had done the right thing, he replied only that he had done the verifiable thing. He was no longer the neutral historian from the beginning of the story, but someone who had accepted the cost of breaking the continuity of erasure. Outside, the town of Black Hollow faced something unprecedented. Attention, reporters, researchers, small but constant protests. The silent pact that had sustained the town was not broken with violence, but exposed to the light of something that could no longer be controlled locally. The climax came when state authorities ordered the emergency listing of the mansion as a protected historical site and opened a formal investigation into illegal civilian uses during the war. The decision did not offer full justice, but it definitively ended the possibility of another closure. The basement would not be reopened to the public, but it wouldn't be forgotten again either. The ultimate consequences did not come in the form of immediate punishments or spectacular revelations. They came as a slow, almost bureaucratic rearrangement of the world that had allowed the basement to remain closed for 80 years. The state investigation moved forward without promises of exemplary culprits. Some names were officially exonerated for lack of direct evidence. Others came to appear in reports as participants in a historical context now considered unacceptable. Hawthorne Manor was sealed off again, this time under public supervision, not as an attempt at erasure, but as a preservation measure. The hidden compartment remained inaccessible, classified as a structural and historical risk area. The difference was fundamental. Now its existence was documented in official, auditable documents, impossible to deny. Ethan left Black Hollow shortly after providing his final explanations. He was neither expelled nor honored. His departure was discreet, consistent with everything he had done up to that point. He returned to academic life, but never went back to the same type of work. He began working as a consultant on institutional memory projects, helping to structure investigations into incomplete archives, deliberate erasures, and excessively sanitized official narratives. His reputation was tarnished. To some, he was a difficult professional. To others, too reliable to be convenient. This didn't completely isolate him, but it redefined his path. He had learned that certain truths don't broaden opportunities, they only limit choices. Laura resumed her position months later, although her standing in the town was never the same. She continued teaching history, now with a greater focus on documentary gaps and alternative versions of events. Black Hollow didn't expel her, but it didn't welcome her back as before either. The town didn't take revenge. It merely defended itself with residual silence. Regarding Margaret Hawthorne, no definitive judgment was issued. Official reports acknowledged her operational participation, but also highlighted the coercive context of the time. She remained an ambiguous figure in the archives, someone who helped keep a system running and at the same time signed off on its closure when it became unsustainable. In the long run, The case of the mansion became an academic reference, not as a monstrous exception, but as an example of the normalization of the unacceptable during periods of crisis. The basement ceased to be a secret and became a fact. Ethan never claimed to feel relief, just a different kind of responsibility. He knew that exposing that story hadn't corrected the past, but it had interrupted its silent repetition. And for him, that was enough. Years later, a small note was added to the digital archive of Hawthorne Manor. It was neither a new revelation nor a significant historical correction. It was merely confirmation that during a routine audit of a federal storage facility, an unmarked box had been found containing incomplete copies of reports similar to those of Black Hollow, scattered across other states under different names, different structures, but with the same operational logic. The mansion is no longer an isolated case. Ethan read the update in silence, already accustomed to the idea that certain stories don't end, they just change form. The basement remained closed, but now it was part of something bigger, a pattern recognized too late to be completely undone. The past had not returned to life, but he wasn't buried anymore either. Stories like that of Hawthorne Manor survive not because they are extraordinary, but because they were possible and accepted in silence. They don't belong only to the past, nor to a specific city. They exist where archives have gaps, where necessary decisions were never reviewed, where the comfort of oblivion seems safer than the weight of truth. If this story provoked discomfort, questioning, or doubt, that's the expected effect. Reflect on how many official narratives you've accepted without asking what was left out. Share this story with those who believe the past is settled, or that certain doors should remain closed. Because some truths don't need to be shouted. They just need to stop being buried.